welcome back to Design for Impact. Yeah, we're talking about prototyping to learn, and it's going to be, as usual, I hope, an pretty interactive session. So I think 2 weeks ago, what we spoke about generating ideas, and we were kind of focusing on the problem of learning online. Like, what are the things involved in learning online, and how could you kind of optimize that for yourself? And 2 weeks ago, we kind of identified different intervention points, and I think we had things around, networking with other people, or, mentoring relationships, or, asynchronous learning. So today, basically what we're going to do is we're going to focus on, picking one of those ideas and then kind of prototyping and understanding, what's our hypothesis with this idea? What do we think will happen? Just basically identifying different ways we can prototype our idea. Does anyone have any questions before we start? Awesome. Feel free to pause me at any time and just ask questions. That was 2 weeks ago. Last week we spoke about building our community. So I think people spoke about Netflix, Bishan was saying, and they also spoke about complex adaptive theory, data privacy, Kinevin model. So I think we might do that maybe potentially once a month, kind of the last week of the month, or we could do it on a separate day. Let me know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you have a specific preference. And we'll see how it goes. So I have two kind of, one fact and two stories. I think people generally say that 90% of products fail, like in the market. I did some research and some digging, and people said that's like a big assumption. There was this specific research paper that said the failure rate is actually 40%, which is still pretty significant. Like if you're spending, 2 or 3 years developing your product before you're really kind of putting it out in the market and launching it, you spend 7.5 years maybe, or 12 years, or 7.5, 9 years to actually develop your first product that's successful. The other really interesting story, and I came across this a couple of weeks ago, was around malaria prevention and mosquito nets. So what happened is, obviously malaria is like a big problem still in Africa. I think one country, I don't remember which country, completely eliminated it a couple of weeks ago. But yeah, it has been a big problem kind of since the 2000s. And so what health officials decided to do was they decided to give mosquito nets to everyone for free, or at a very low cost. Now, I think a lot of people kind of used mosquito nets for what they were designed for, but a lot of other people use them as fishing nets and soccer goals. And that's kind of why we talk about, it's really important to experiment. It's really important to prototype, especially when you're trying to tackle a complex problem, because you don't actually know how the system will react. You don't know how different organizations will react. You don't know how people will react. And that's kind of the purpose of today's kind of discussion, is to kind of talk about how can we prototype ideas to see how the system is learning, how the system is reacting and getting impacted. Any thoughts on that, or any kind of similar stories from your personal experiences as to, solutions that people, were really excited for and thought they would succeed, and then they got rolled out and kind of fell apart or had adverse consequences?
Not personally, but the one I've always been taught that I go back to is the infant warmers in Dhaka. You guys heard this one? So the mortality rate in I don't remember if it was Bangladesh or Myanmar, really low. They found it was because infants just needed access to warmers, and so the first thing that the World Health Organization did was just buy a bunch of these incubators and throw them in hospitals, and it didn't work. They found out that it's because most babies were being delivered at home, and rural babies weren't being born in hospitals. They just didn't have access to hospitals. So they invented these warming blankets that didn't even need electricity. They were just self-contained.
Mm.
solved everything. But just being that far out of context is what broke it and wasted a ton of money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So obviously the best case scenario is you kind of waste a lot of money. The worst case scenario is you have, you kind of go against the goal that you're trying to achieve. So the first activity we're gonna do, it's on the Miro board. So Sashin, you might not have access to that, but feel free to kind of join the discussion. So we want to think of 15 ways you could have prototyped using mosquito nets to prevent malaria. So if you're in that team, kind of 5 or 10 years ago, what would you have said? Like, how could we prototype mosquito nets and see how the system would react?
Is one way. You might do it in an urban population and do it in a rural population and see if how they each respond, what kind of instructions they need, kind of questions they have, that sort of.
This is Dawn. Another thought I had was finding out first what the people who you're planning to present these to, what they're already doing about mosquitoes. How do they handle mosquitoes currently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you don't want to assume, like, I'm thinking that we shouldn't assume what the problem is, but rather you're wanting to find out what the behavior is or the attitude toward it is without the net first.
Yeah.
Right. Or in a co-design environment, I think we should be then inviting people to help us show what else can be done from a mosquito net. But I think over here, the purpose is very, very clear that we want to prevent malaria, nothing else, nothing more. We want people to be safe from mosquito bites. And we want the mosquito nets to be used in a certain way such that it is not misused.
Yeah.
And we don't drift away from the purpose. So I think tent was something that I thought could be used because, again, I'm just speaking on the top of my mind that we would have people who are homeless in Africa. We would have people who would not have a shelter to probably live and so on. And yet we have to manage the health conditions around them.
Yeah.
So a tent makes sense. But then when you say 15 ways, so my first thought was, what else can be done of that tent so that we are helping these people be safe from malaria?
That's a good one. Thanks, Prashant. Jorge or Hannah, do you guys have any ideas? Pia?
I was thinking, but well, I was reading also the rest of the postings. What I was taught and always do is just go to the place and start doing like you how do you say this? Give the nets to certain people like a sample, and then you get feedback. I wrote to journal with the users why they chose to use it in other environments or something like that, but I cannot come up with another different.
No, that's a good idea. Anyone else before we go to the next part?
I guess this is kind of similar to what Bhushan was just talking about, but I guess determining if people aren't using the net properly because they don't understand that they should be using the net in a specific way, or because they're choosing to use the net in a different way than it was provided for. So I guess that'd be an important thing to determine.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of thing that you could find out through a prototype. You give it out and you see what people do, and you find out, for example, that people don't understand it, or it's more useful for them if they use it for mosquito nets because they're not as fishing nets because they're not worried about mosquitoes, for example. Awesome. Let's move forward. So some principles to keep in mind when you're thinking, and I think Jorge really kind of pointed that out when he spoke. One of the big things around prototyping to learn is that you really need to take action. It's great kind of sitting in a room or, asking people, what would you do with this thing? But you don't really get an accurate picture of what people would do unless you actually get them to act. So it's both about you acting as a designer or change maker to kind of gain confidence. So, you acting by building a visual of a complex system, or you acting to create a prototype. And it's also about getting, you know, the people who use the product or service that you're creating to act, to see how, you know, what benefit would that have, what impact would it have on the system. So that's really around short feedback loops. So, you know, it's rather than kind of doing, you know, really long, complicated feedback loops, you just want to do like, you know, weekly or fortnightly feedback loops. Okay, let's test something quickly, see what happens with it, and then kind of come back to a drawing board, see what we learned, and keep going. The second one is focusing on action. So like I said, it's really important to kind of act, because that's the only way you'll see what the system will do. You want to understand the value of your idea, but you also want to understand the impact. And, you know, I'm sure the mosquito nets were really valuable, right? But probably not a lot of people foresaw the impact of, you know, it getting used as a soccer goal. You want to start with the biggest risks, right? So rather than kind of, you know, going from like 20% sure the idea will work how you expect it to 30% sure, you want to kind of go from 20% sure to 80% sure. So if you really kind of prioritize the biggest risks to your idea, then you can test that risk, and then over time you want to kind of increase your confidence in an idea. Awesome. So this is you probably see a lot of this. I just made this up myself, to be honest, but you'll probably see kind of different iterations of this. So you kind of, you know, you generate the ideas, and then you finally are like, okay, we think these, you know, 2 or 3 ideas might work. You start building concepts for them, and we'll talk about different ways of prototyping, or, you know, creating concepts. And then you really want to kind of get in the loop of prototyping and testing. So, you know, you're creating a hypothesis, you're designing the prototype, you're taking it to market, and then you're learning, and then, you know, you're iterating. You're either throwing out that prototype or prototyping another idea, or, you know, changing the prototype slightly to address what you learned. Eventually you kind of, okay, we're pretty confident now, let's actually build this thing. So that's kind of the overview, the overview of the process. What we're really going to focus on today is really like from concept to, you know, hypothesis and designing the prototype. And then, you know, we can talk about different ways you can take it to market and things. Cool. So some helpful ways to think about like prototyping. You want a prototype that's something that's helpful at all stages of your prototype, right? So, you know, people often think of like a prototype as like a component of the final thing. That's not very helpful, because a component might not be very useful for people, right? Whereas a prototype of a car, for example, or like a moving vehicle, could be like a skateboard, right? At each stage, the user can, or the person can actually use this thing, right? It's not that they, you know, get a steering wheel and it's like, yeah, it's a great steering wheel, but can't do much with it. You know, they get a skateboard, or you get a, you know, a bicycle or a bike. Another way is, another way to kind of think of prototypes is that they start really rough, and over time you kind of build evidence as to why this prototype will work, and you change the prototype based on what you learned. So your granularity of your prototype and your, you know, your progress and your evidence for success kind of increases over time. So it's not like an overnight thing where you're like, yeah, I'll test it once, great, it's worked really well, you know, there's nothing else we can learn. You actually kind of, it's all about iteration. Again, a different way is kind of like, okay, here's like an idea, right? Which is like what we did 2 weeks ago, is like network with other people. Okay, well, hold on, what does that actually look like, right? And then you kind of, you know, you might build a storyboard, and then you might actually take like a, you know, build the networking site, like a one page, to see, you know, how does this resonate? How does this work? I'll skip this one. Cool. So the next activity, what we might do is I'll probably split you into 2 teams. Don't so much focus on the ideas. And we'll spend probably 15 to 20 minutes on this one. So as a team, I want you to pick an idea from the ones you've generated. You can pick any idea. It doesn't matter. And then develop your idea. So there's questions like, give it a title, you know, draw it or describe how it would work. And then talk about, you know, what are the biggest risks with this idea, or what could we really test? Any questions before I split you into groups and we go to the mirror board?
Yeah, on your last graphic there, what are your thoughts on concept testing, or are you kind of baking concept testing into prototyping?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I think that's a really good question. I'm smiling because I've been thinking a lot about concept testing, and I think it's like, look, it's a useful way of like getting initial feedback. You know, do people absolutely like hate this idea and can just poke holes in it, and you're like, okay, this is probably not a good idea. But at the same time, it's not enough to go on. Like, you know, if I asked you, you know, how many people of you would pay for this thing, you're going to be really nice to me and say, yeah, I would do it. You know, or you know, 80% of you, 70% of you might say it. And then when it actually comes down to it, you're like, whoa, no, that's too much money. Or, you know, it's not valuable for me, or I don't think it will work, or, you know, maybe next month or something. So I think concept testing is helpful, but you want to do more testing than that. You actually want to get people to act and kind of give them a decision. Like, I think in the 4-hour work week, Tim Ferriss talks about like setting up a site and actually kind of putting ads out, you know, for this new idea that you have, and kind of taking people all the way to checkout, right? So, you know, they know the price, they know what the product is about, they have every intention to check out. So he talks about that as like a way to test an idea before you even have like a product or a service. So I think it's really helpful to kind of, yeah, actually see what people would do, rather than just asking what they would do. I think people are not very good at, you know, telling you what their future selves would do. Does anyone have any thoughts to that? Kyle, what do you think?
I've been finding that people usually don't get the fidelity right when they want to go after a concept test. It's usually like just a hair short of a clickable user test.
Yeah.
And they just want you to turn into screenshots and go concept test. You might as well just go the extra step. Like they've already invested way too much at that point. You might as well double down and have a true user test and get the real feedback. But at that point, they're kind of, they're reluctant. I've seen it work when in a design thinking environment, when you're workshopping and you're building a storyboard and you're standing in front of it and giving feedback, and then you're erasing the whiteboard and you're rebuilding it, and it's just that quick. But otherwise, you have to find the perfect fidelity for it to work right.
Yeah, and I think the other interesting thing with like higher fidelity stuff is that when people see it's really polished and they feel like you've put a lot of effort into it, they're like reluctant to be like, this is a crap idea. Whereas if they like just see like you drawing random sketches, they'll be like, oh yeah, it could work, but you know, you need to change this and that. So they're much more likely to give feedback. Awesome question there. Cool. So any questions about the activity? So pick an idea as a group and then go through. You'll see the template on Miro. So it should be pretty straightforward. Any thoughts or reflections on that?
It's kind of funny how you said that you guys are just like pinging stuff on the board, because we were just like very focused talking together the whole time and not really like putting a bunch of stuff up. So we took a very opposite approach to what you did in our process.
Yeah, right. So you went from like one extreme to the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it was a nice exercise that we did, and creating a story and then trying to find out what would work, what would not work, and then bouncing off ideas very quickly. That really helped for us. And we didn't try to, I think, we didn't try to judge our ideas, because we just went all out and we put everything that we could think of. Mm-hmm. In keeping ourselves in those situations, what would work, what would not work. I think that helped. And then secondly, what also helped was the fact that we were developing something on AR and online learning. So we have some experience with online learning, and we're just trying to translate that experience into augmented reality, AR. And that helped. The illustrations helped, the photograph helped us to visualize what it would look like. And we actually brought in our personal experiences. So it was a great exercise.
Awesome. Sounds good. So that's really good to hear, Bishan. we want to do is formulating a hypothesis, and we spoke about this a bit. Often, you know, people have like different ideas around why this specific idea will work or why they think it might work, and it's really important to kind of, you know, not just come up with like one hypothesis that you're like, you know, this is like the answer, but kind of, you know, talk amongst yourselves and say, okay, why do you think the idea will work? You know, how you know, what things will it cause that will have a positive impact, and kind of use the causal looping map or diagram or approach that we used before to kind of say, okay, we think if, you know, if this idea does this, then this will happen, that will be the result, but then there might be a negative feedback loop, and we might want to kind of examine that. So feel free to kind of visualize your hypothesis as well, rather than just, you know, writing, you know, if this, then that, and that, and that's the end. So let's see. Yeah. So an example is like, you know, like after going through it, if we invest in getting healthcare insights, then we'll be able to prevent diseases, right, and achieve better health outcomes. And then your experiment is really focused on that. Like, okay, we'll invest in getting healthcare insights, and then we'll try to measure, okay, are we able to prevent diseases, or are we able to achieve better health outcomes for patients? Or, you know, what does that mean? Do doctors feel, for example, more kind of understanding of what's happening, or, you know, they can expect what people come in for? Does that make sense? So I'll post an example on the Miro board as well, of formulating a hypothesis, kind of like a visual example to help guide you. Yeah, so that's kind of formulating hypothesis in a nutshell, is just kind of talking and visualizing what do you think will happen with this idea? Like, why do you think it will work, basically, and what, you know, what's your experiment really going to try to test as part of that? Any questions around that? Cool. So if your team kind of didn't get like time to visualize exactly what the idea could look like, feel free to spend kind of a couple of minutes on that. And then the rest of your 10 minutes really is spent on, you know, discussing what the hypothesis is, and then, you know, having like a hypothesis that you can share back by the end of the session, by the end of the 10 minutes. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. Awesome. I'll send you back into the same rooms. Awesome. So so I guess we want to hear back from each team, and we probably have two questions. The first one is like, what's your idea? And the second one's, what's your hypothesis? And then there is a third question, which is any kind of reflections on that exercise. We might start with Kyle, Sachin, Dawn, and Jorge. Your team.
All right, I'll talk about our idea. Our hypothesis is very different than the other board. So our idea, we're calling it Cultivator, temporary name for now. But the idea we sort of changed a little bit from what we had up there earlier was, rather than integrating practicing a new school into just normal life, into volunteer work. And so how this would work was that you would have a network of people going out and figuring out volunteer opportunities, recruiting skilled learners, associating that with some sort of coach that can support those volunteer needs and skilled learners, bringing people that are trying to learn that new skill into a real life situation where actual results are being produced, feedback and experience is gained, and then actually like delivering for not-for-profits and learning at the same time. And so everybody wins. Our hypothesis we wrote out as a massive feedback loop. It's a little bit hard to articulate.
Yeah.
But I would say stare at it for a moment. It's pretty massive.
What would you kind of summarize it as?
Essentially, if we can string those items together, the non-for-profit looking for volunteers, the new skill coaches, connect basically that process then what we're doing is we are people are learning new skills. They're networking. They're getting getting real life experience to apply to possibly new jobs, but also delivering real life results and getting personal satisfaction out of it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Awesome. Sounds good. Hannah's team, any thoughts?
So we went ahead and we created we visualized a company called Virtual Learning. And we thought that this idea of having people to learn from anywhere using AR, not VR, AR. And we thought it would be helpful for those for companies like Coursera or Udemy, anyone who's having an online presence and they are already in the business of online learning, and for them to create a virtual classroom for those who are subscribing to their courses. Our hypothesis was that the value that it would bring was for people who are learning from away from the universities and classrooms. It will give them an experience of a virtual classroom. It will give them the advantage of interacting with their classmates even though they are not in a classroom.
Yeah.
One of the other things is that they will be able to take classes from virtually anywhere as long as there's internet.
Yeah.
They don't need to be in front of their TVs or sorry, in front of their desktops and iPads and so on.
Mm-hmm.
With their glasses, they could actually be standing on the street as long as there's a clean wall in front of them, so they would be able to interact with it and so on.
Yeah.
Of course, you can't be standing in the rain because that's not going to work.
Yeah.
And basically, yeah, you'll have mist on your glasses, and then that's not going to work out.
Cool.
But then we were discussing about the medicine part, and that's where I think you disconnected. And one of the things was that medicine students don't come on Coursera to learn medicine.
Mm.
So if you want to learn medicine, then you have to go to a college, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. So Sheen as well was saying that, or driving. I mean, unless you've got a Tesla on autopilot, it's legal to do it. But then you could die, so you have to be careful. So we're going to talk quickly about some ways to prototype, and then we're going to have 5 minutes to kind of, talk about for each team to talk about what they could prototype. So the first one is Mechanical Turk, and it's basically like faking it, like making it look automated, right? But it's actually fake. And you can there's a link in the further readings that you can check out as to, what each of these exactly are. But you can do, clickable prototypes, you can do storyboards, you can do role playing. You can do advertising and click-throughs to like understand interest in this idea, or, what people think. And you could actually just do a pilot. Like, obviously you'd want to do some testing before you do a full-on pilot, but you could do a pilot. Awesome. So instead of 20 minutes, I'm going to give you 5. And basically it's briefly talking about how would you prototype your idea. And I think the other big question is like, how would you actually measure, or what would you measure? Like, what are the things that you're looking for? Is it like people's interest? Is it how people use this thing? Is it, how much they're willing to spend, or something else? Yeah. Any questions?
We can find the links you mentioned, which
I will.
elaborate.
I'm not sure if you're on our Slack channel, but I'll send you the link to our Slack channel. I usually post all the presentations on there.
Perfect.
Cool. Awesome. All right. See you guys in 5 minutes. Awesome. Thanks for coming back, team. So what we'll do next time is we'll actually so next week we'll just focus on like actually creating the prototype. So it'll be kind of very hands-on. So bring, pens and lots of drawings and things. Yeah, but yeah, sorry to rush you kind of at the end. So does each team want to kind of share maybe what their prototype would be and what the measures they would use?
our team, it was essentially we aligned on that. Given the magnitude of variables and the length of time to observe, a pilot would be ideal, and a diary study would be optimal, given that a lot of the things require a lot of context to measure, and devoid of the context, it wouldn't justify, and it would be a huge mathematical equation. So a diary study makes more sense.
Yep. Awesome. Sounds good. Next week, I'm interested to hear what you think the measures would be for that. Like, what measures would you actually be tracking? What about Hannah and Pia and Bishan's team? Any thoughts around what your prototype idea would be and what you would measure?
Yes, so I think the discussion was around whether people would really be interested in virtual learning. And so I thought we could have a co-creation session with a few students and professors who would be interested or not interested in such an idea. And then we'll make cardboard glasses and a few paper sketches of the UI to see how they are reacting. And then we'll ask for their feedback on the next steps.
Cool. Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah. So again, similar kind of looking forward, if you're going to put an ad, come ready next week to kind of, start writing examples and things like that. Awesome. So,
Thank you.
And yeah, see everyone next week.
Thanks, Abram.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Have a good week.